The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical by Shane Claiborne. Jesus is for losers. A few years back, I was talking with a homeless guy in an alley downtown, and he started sharing with me about God. He was familiar with the Bible, but kept talking about the Christians in the third person. A little confused, I finally asked him, "Are you not a Christian?" "Oh no," he said. "I am far too messed up." I asked him what he thought a Christian is, and he said, someone who's got their stuff together and has things figured out. I confessed that I must not be a Christian either, and that I wasn't sure if I'd ever met one, and we laughed. We read together the passage where Jesus tells the Pharisees, the ones who had things together, It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Matthew chapter 9, verse 12 to 13. The gospel is good news for sick people and is disturbing for those who think they've got it all together. Some of us have been told our whole lives that we are wretched, but the gospel reminds us that we are beautiful. Others of us have been told our whole lives that we are beautiful, but the gospel reminds us that we are also wretched. The church is a place where we can stand up and say we are wretched, and everyone will nod and agree and remind us that we are also beautiful. One thing I've learned from believers and from activists alike is that the community can be built around a common self-righteousness or around a common brokenness. Both are magnetic. People are drawn toward folks who have it all together or who look like they do. People are also drawn toward folks who know they don't have it all together and are not willing to fake it. Christianity can be built around isolating ourselves from evildoers and sinners, creating a community of religious piety and moral piety. That's the Christianity I grew up with. Christianity can also be built around joining with the broken sinners and evildoers of our world, crying out to God, groaning for grace. That's the Christianity I've fallen in love with. In Luke 18:10-14, Jesus tells us a remarkable story about two folks praying. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one of the Pharisees and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his chest and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God." The Pharisee, a member of the sects of Judaism that made up the religious elite in Roman Empire, boasts of his religion devotion and moral obedience, thanking God that he is not like the evildoers. Then there is a tax collector who stands at a distance and dares not even look up to heaven. He just beats his chest and says, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And it's the old tax collector rather than the Pharisee who goes home justified before God. The problem of evildoing. Taken to its extremes, the infection of Pharisaic self-righteousness. The Pharisees were obsessed with purity, which Jesus compares to a yeast that creeps its way through dough, would lead us to deem our duty to rid the world of losers and evildoers, whether we define evildoers as warmongers or anarchists. Like pulling weeds out of a garden, only a few stubborn anarchists or Jerry Falwell are going to argue that September 11th was what America deserved, and only a few articulate speechwriters are going to call America unequivocally good. After all, even Jesus warns us that no one is good except God alone. Mark 10:18. Many of us want the same things. We want the world to be rid of evil. We want justice. We want to liberate the oppressed. The question is, how do we do that? Ironically, most violence comes from a deep desire for justice. No one likes weeds in their garden, and no one likes evil in the world. We all would like to rid the world of evil and have gardens free of weeds, which is probably why all the talk of good and evil is so attractive. But the problem, says Jesus, is that if we try to pull up the weeds from the garden, we will rip the weed up too. In Matthew 13:24-30, he gives a firm command to let the wheat and the weeds grow together, and to let God sort them out at harvest. And we are not God. Rich Mullins used to say, "I know, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, but I just want to be about the Father's business." He was joking, of course. If you've seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, if you haven't, I'd recommend just reading the book. You know that you can't help but walk away from that movie with the overwhelming sense of Jesus' love for evildoers. Even while the Roman soldiers are tearing his flesh apart, he cries, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." The big question seems to be what to do with evil. And when it comes to the world's logic of redemptive violence, Christians have a major stumbling block on their hands, namely the cross. It goes all the way back to the original sin in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are invited to enjoy the fruit of all the trees except one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent tempts them to eat of that fruit by telling them that if they do, they will be like God. And so Adam and Eve grubbed down on it, and humanity still craves the fruit that's on the tree. It's darn good fruit, but it's the only fruit reserved only for God. It's not for ambitious, young, naked couples or for zealous, old, fully armored military folks. The Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes just don't seem like the best tools with which to lead an empire or a superpower. The truth that we have to lose our lives in order to find them doesn't sound like a good plan for national security. As our troubadour Woody Guthrie says, if Jesus preached in New York what he preached in Galilee, we'd lay him in his grave again, especially if he did it on Wall Street. I guess that's why we hear a lot about God's blessings and about God's expanding our territory, but very little about cross or a love for enemies. There comes a point where we recognize we're trying to serve two masters, and we have to choose which one we will serve. Our arms are just not big enough to carry both the cross and the sword. We can learn from the bloody pages of history. The more vigorous we try to root out evil by force, the more evil will escalate. For every Muslim extremist killed, another is created. Likewise, the more passionate we love our enemies, the more evil will diminish. This is also the story of the martyrs. For every Christian killed at the hands of evil, another would rise up, converted by their faith, self-sacrificial love. And historically, Christianity spreads most rapid when we are killed at the hands of evildoers without retaliating. It's the story of the growth of the church during the greatest persecutions. They wrote that for every one of them who was killed, there were 10 converts. As the saying goes, in the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the saints. The paradox is that the church is the healthiest during eras of persecution, and it gets sick during periods of comfort and ease and power. It is no surprise that statistics show Muslim people are less open to Christianity now than they were years ago. Pharisaic extremists are alive today in every religion, in Islam and Christianity and Judaism. Church history is filled with movements of piety, like the Puritans, who marked themselves by separating from the unholy and deemed it their duty to destroy all that is not pure in the world. And the pages of the church history are filled with the embarrassing bloodstains left by Christian movements that have tried to rid the world of evil by the sword. Martyrs, heretics, the busy guillotine of the English Reformation, and the cruel punishments of the Spanish Inquisition. In such times, the cross always loses. And yet, there is a constant whisper of the cross. Church history is also full of movements that remained faithful to the cross, even when it appeared that the world would destroy them. Christians knew that God would be faithful, even as they remained faithful. History is also filled with movements of people who cry out to God that they are unholy, who identify and confess their sins, such as Europe's Confessing Church and the college revivals in the United States that began with humble confession of sins, with people beating their chests before each other and God. Perhaps one of the most beautiful things that contemporary church could do is to confess our sins to the world, to humbly get on our knees and repent for the terrible things we have done in the name of God. In his book, Blue Like Jazz, author Don Miller tells the delightful story of how he and his friends dressed like monks and set up a confessional booth on the notoriously heathen college campus. But instead of hearing other people's confessions, They were confessing their sins as Christians and the sins of Christendom to anyone who is willing to listen and forgive. I think the world would be willing to listen to a church on its knees, a church that doesn't pretend to be perfect or to have all the answers. I think a mystical sacramental healing can begin with us and extend into the wounds of our world. That stuff Jesus warned us to beware of, the yeast of the Pharisees, is so infectious today in the camps of both liberals and conservatives. Conservatives stand up and thank God that they are not like the homosexuals, the Muslims, the liberals. Liberals stand up and thank God that they are not like the war makers, the yuppies, the conservatives. It is similar self-righteousness, just with different definitions of evil doing. It can paralyze us in judgment and guilt and rob us of life. Rather than separating ourselves from everyone we consider impure, maybe we are better off beating our chests and praying that God would be merciful enough to save us from this present ugliness and to make our lives so beautiful that people cannot resist that mercy. Cracks let the light come in. St. John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish monk and a mystic philosopher, understood the emptiness and pain of human existence. He wrote a book called The Dark Night of the Soul. For goodness sake, goth kids, dig him. He coined the old saying, "The cracks let the light come in." And yes, Leonard Cohen sings it well in his song Anthem. Somehow God likes broken vessels. I am convinced that Jesus came not to simply make bad people good, but to bring dead people to life. We can be moral, but not alive. A lot of conservatives and liberals have taught me that, and I myself have been a victim of the parasitic yeast infection. There are many people who are morally pure, but devoid of any life, joy, or celebration. For some, this purity means that we do not touch anything that is secular, and for others, it means that we do not eat anything that is not organic. But if it is not born of relationships, it is not liberating for the oppressed or the oppressors. If it is not marked by raw, passionate love, then it is the same old self-righteousness that does little more than flaunt our own purity by making the rest of the world see how dirty they are. No matter where it pops up, this yeast hinders us from seeing God's image in every human being. Be they a soldier or a centurion, a tax collector or a stockbroker, a zealot or an anarchist, no one is beyond redemption. The tax collector knows he is a sinner and just cries out to God for grace. When we are first aware of our own brokenness, our eyes are open to see our own faces in the faces of the oppressed and to see our own hands in the hands of our oppressors. Then we shall all be truly free. The tax collector teaches us, and does Jesus, that this gospel is for sick people, not for the righteous. There is another breed of extremists rising up. We are sinners beating our chests, crying out to God, "Have mercy on us." We will beat our chests outside the White House, outside the abortion clinics in New York on September 11th, in the ghettos of Philadelphia. We will hurt no one, although our chests may get a little sore. We will love evildoers, even if it costs us our lives. And then we will see evildoers become extremists for grace. This is the story of our faith. The God of losers. Whenever someone tells me they have rejected God, I say, "Tell me about the God you rejected." And as they describe a God of condemnation, of laws and lightning bolts, of frowning gray-haired people and boring meetings, I usually confess I too have rejected that God. I've met a lot of Christians who say, if people knew all about all of my struggles and weaknesses, they would never want to be a Christian. I think just the opposite is true. If people really knew what idiots we are in all our brokenness and vulnerability, they would know that they can give this thing a shot too. Christianity is for sick people. Rich Mullins used to say, whenever people say Christians are hypocrites, I say, duh. Every time we come together, we are confessing that we are hypocrites, weaklings, in need of God and each other. We know that we cannot do life alone, and that the good news is that we don't have to. We are created for community. Bono, the great theologian, a decent rock star, said it like this in the introduction to a book of selections from the Psalms. The fact that the scriptures are brimful of hustlers, murderers, cowards, adulterers, and mercenaries used to shock me. Now it is a source of great comfort. Consider King David, who many Christians remember as a man after God's own heart. Well, David breaks just about every one of the big 10 commandments in about 2 chapters of the Bible. He covets, commits adultery, lies, murders, and this is all after he answered God's call. And yet he is still one of the losers God trusted and used. Matthew's gospel gives us the genealogy of Jesus, which could compete with any of our families on the dysfunctionary thermometer. One of my favorite parts is when Matthew gets to the section of the genealogy that involves David's infamous sex scandal with Bathsheba. He writes, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. He names other women in the lineage, but when he gets to Bathsheba, he makes sure we all remember everything that went on there. David had Uriah killed. What a mess. So if that is the son of God's lineage, none of us can be too bad off. No wonder people were always asking about Jesus. Whose kid is this? Isn't he from Nazareth? Galilee was a hub of peasant revolts and uprisings. It was notorious, the Badlands. Whenever people call our neighborhood the Badlands, as it is commonly referred to by locals, and they imply that nothing good can come from here, I remind them that's exactly what people said about Nazareth, and look what showed up there. Consider the fact that Jesus tells parables like the one about the Good Samaritan. Like a hero, a Samaritan? Jews did not like Samaritans. Thought they had some whacked out views about God and worship. They wouldn't even walk through Samaria. But Jesus tells a story in which the Samaritan is the hero and the priest is the loser who passes his neighbor by. That's the kind of thing that ticked off the religious elite. I recently spoke at a large youth gathering. Afterward, a crowd of teenagers came up and asked for my autograph. At first, I laughed at the idea, but then my heart ached, as they told me that they rarely got to actually meet the speaker. Each night, I stayed until all the kids were gone. We prayed together, told jokes, sat around, and sang songs. It was incredible. And yet, some still asked for autographs. So here's what I did. I explained to them that I would write them a note, and this is what I wrote. This is not an autograph because there is nothing special about me, and that is not also special about you. Never forget that you are beautiful, just like everyone else, and never forget that you are a fool, just like everyone else. Yeah, my hand got tired, but I think they began to get it. Rich Mullins used to say, alluding to the Old Testament story in which God speaks through a donkey. God spoke to Balaam through his ass, and God's been speaking through them ever since. So, if God should choose to use us, we shouldn't think too highly of ourselves, and we should never assume that God cannot use someone no matter how ornery or awkward they may appear. A buddy of mine who is a fairly prominent youth minister just told me about the trip he took with a bunch of teenagers to one of those mountaintop spiritual retreats with lots of tears, confessions, and spiritual goosebumps. On the way up, the van had a flat tire of the worst kind. In the rain, no tools, a bad spare. As all the kids stared out the window, his temper escalated and went beyond the tipping point. He lost it and started yelling, cussing, and kicking the blessed thing. Finally, he was able to get the van going, climbed back in, and told everybody to shut up and leave him alone for a bit. A little embarrassed, they headed on to the retreat. With a few snickers coming from the back of the van, he said the retreat was the same thing it was every year, with the worship, preaching, and altar call. But that year something crazy happened. One of his toughest kids from the ghetto told him the week after they returned that he had given his life to Jesus. My friend was a bit stunned and asked him to explain how it happened. Was it the message, the altar call? The young man said, no. It was on the way up when I saw you cussing at the van. I thought, if he can be a Christian, I can give this thing a shot too. There are so many people who are longing to be brought to life, who know all too well that they have done evil and long to hear not only of a God who embraces evildoers, but also a church that does the same. Overcoming darkness. In the early days of our community, Michelle, a founding partner of the Simple Way, and I headed out to get a loaf of bread. We walked underneath the L tracks from our block of our house, a strip notorious for its prostitution and drug trafficking, where the air is thick with tears and struggle. We walked past an alley, and tucked inside was a woman, tattered, cold, and on crutches. She approached me, asking if I wanted her services. Our hearts sank, but we scurried on to get our bread. Then we headed quickly home, nodding at the woman as we passed. When we got home and opened the bread, we noticed the bag had a large gash in the side, and the bread had gone bad. We would have to go back, and we both knew what that meant. We would have to walk by that woman again. We walked by the alley and saw her there crying, shivering. We got her bread, and as we saw her yet again, we could not just pass by. We stopped and told her we cared for her, and that she was precious, worth more than a few bucks for tricks on the avenue. We explained that we had a home that was a safe place to get warm and have a snack. So she stumbled onto the crutches and came home with us. As soon as we entered the house, she started weeping hysterically. Michelle held her as she wept. When she had gained her composure, she said, "You are all Christians, aren't you?" Michelle and I looked at each other, startled. We had nothing to say about God or Jesus, and our house doesn't have a cross in the window, a neon Jesus Saves sign, or even a little Christian fish on the wall. She said, "I know you are Christians because you shine." I used to be in love with Jesus like that, and when I shine like diamonds in the sky, like the stars. But it was a cold, dark world, and I lost my shine a little while back. I lost my shine on those streets. At that point, we were all weeping. She asked us to pray with her that she might shine again. We did. We prayed that this dark world would not take away our shine. Days and weeks went by, and we did not see her. One day, there was a knock on the door, and I opened it. On the steps, there was a lovely lady with a contagious ear-to-ear smile. We stared at each other. We see a lot of people, so I was going to try to fake recognizing her, but she called my bluff and beat me to it. "Of course you didn't recognize me, because I'm shining again. I'm shining." Then I knew. She went on to explain how deeply she had fallen in love with God again. She said that she wanted to give us something to thank us for our hospitality, but sadly confessed, "While I was on the streets, I lost everything I owned, except this." She pulled out a box and apologetically confessed that she smoked a lot and always collected the Marlboro points from the cigarette packs. "So this is all I have, but I want you to have it." And she handed me a box bursting at its seams with hundreds of Marlboro miles. It's one of the most precious gifts I've ever been given, like receiving the widow's last pennies. And they make good Bible markers. Now every time I'm speaking somewhere and open up the word, I see a Marlboro mile, and the elders raise their eyebrows, and I'm reminded of all the broken lives that have lost their shine a little while back. The scandal of grace. There's another person who felt the world killed the good in him, a young man who was decorated Army veteran in the 1991 Gulf War. I remember reading the letters he wrote from the war, in which he told his family how hard it was to kill. He told them he felt like he was turning into an animal because day after day it became a little easier to kill. His name was Timothy McVeigh. He came home from serving in the Army Special Forces, horrified, crazy, dehumanized, and became the worst domestic terrorist we had ever seen. His essays cry out against the bloodshed he saw and created in Iraq. Do people think that government workers in Iraq are any less human than those in Oklahoma City? Do they think that Iraqis don't have families who will grieve and mourn the loss of their loved ones? Do people believe that the killing of a foreigner is somehow different than the killing of Americans? No doubt his mind had been tragically deranged by the myth of redemptive violence. He bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City in hopes that complacent Americans could see what collateral damage looks like and cry out against bloodshed everywhere, even in Iraq. Instead, the government that had trained him to kill killed him, to teach the rest of us that it is wrong to kill. Dear God, liberate us from the logic of redemptive violence. One of the people I've grown to love is a man named Bud Welsh. He lost 23-year-old daughter, Julie Marie, in that Oklahoma City bombing at the hands of Timothy McVeigh. He says he went through a period of rage when he wanted Timothy dead. "I wanted him to fry," he says. "I'd have killed him myself if I had the chance." But there was a moment when he remembered the words of his daughter, who had been a courageous advocate for reconciliation. She used to say, "Execution teaches hatred." It wasn't long before Bud decided to interrupt that cycle of hatred and violence and arranged a visit with McVeigh's dad and family. As they met, Bud says he grew to love them dearly, and to this day says he never felt closer to God than amid that union. He decided to travel around the country speaking about reconciliation and against the death penalty, which teaches that some people are beyond redemption, and pleading for the life of Timothy McVeigh. And he says he felt a tremendous weight had lifted from his shoulders. As he worked through his anger and pain and confusion, he began to see this evil spiral of redemptive violence must stop with him. And he began to look into the eyes of Timothy McVeigh, the murderer, and see the image of God. He longed for him to experience love, grace, and forgiveness. Bud is one who still believes in the scandal of grace. Ironically, when I was giving that talk titled The Scandal of Grace, I told the story of Bud Welsh as I talked about how God's love extends to all losers, whether Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Saul of Tarsus, Timothy McVeigh, or me. The program team showed a PowerPoint presentation using the visual edition of Philip Yancey's work, What's So Amazing About Grace. In the PowerPoint, different images pop up behind words, Amazing Grace that saved a wretch like me. And different people's faces are branded with the words like me, Mother Teresa, sports stars, celebrities, and one of them was Timothy McVeigh. It created such discomfort that the program team was told to remove the image of Timothy from the presentation before the second service. There's something scandalous about grace, and it's almost embarrassing that God loves losers so much. It flies in the face of the world's myth of redemptive violence. No wonder the early Christians had such bad reputations and questionable credibility. No wonder they were called the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, as one of the leaders, a former murderer himself, wrote, 1 Corinthians 4:13. It's the old eye for an eye thing that gets us. But the more I've studied the Hebrew scriptures, the more I'm convinced that this was just a boundary for people who lashed back. As the young Exodus people were trying to discover a new way of living outside the empire, God made sure there were some boundaries. If someone breaks your arm, you cannot go back and break their arm, and then their leg too. Just like in old feudal wars or with contemporary gangs, things escalate. A shock and awe bombing leads to a shock and awe beheading. A Pearl Harbor leads to Hiroshima. A murder leads to an execution. A rude look leads to a cold shoulder. An eye for an eye. We have indeed heard before and learned its logic all too well. But Jesus comes declaring in his State of the Union Sermon on the Mount address, Matthew 5:38, "You have heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But there is another way, and it's a good thing, since, as Gandhi and King used to say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth leaves the whole world blind, and with dentures." The gospel tells a story of a group of people who are ready to stone an adulteress. Stoning was the legal consequence of adultery. They asked Jesus for his support in this death penalty case. His response is that they are all adulterers. He says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a first stone at her." John 8:7. And the people drop their stones and walk away with their heads bowed. We want to kill the murderers, but Jesus says that we are all murderers. Anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the Sanhedrin, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fires of hell. Matthew 5:22. And again, the stones dropped. We are all murderers and adulterous and terrorists, and we are all precious. When we look through the eyes of Jesus, we see new things in people. In the murderers, we see our own hatred. In the addicts, we see our own addictions. In the saints, we catch a glimpse of our own holiness. We can see our brokenness, our own violence, our own ability to destroy. And we can see our own sadness, our own capacity to love and forgive. When we realize that we are both wretched and beautiful, we are freed to see others the same way. In his work, I and Thou, brilliant European thinker Martin Buber speaks of how we can see a person as simply a material object, something you look at, or we can look into a person and enter the sacredness of their humanity so that they become a thou. And as a Jewish philosopher who immigrated to Palestine to advocate for Arab-Jew cooperation, Buber knew too well how easily we objectify and demonize others. All the time we look at people, hot girls, beggars, pop star, white folks, black folks, people with suits or dreadlocks. But over time we can develop new eyes and look into people. Rather than looking at people as sex objects or work tools, we can see them as sacred. We can enter the holiest of holies through their eyes. They can become a thou. I saw this happen when the dying and the lepers whispered that sacred Hindi word, namaste. And I saw it again in Iraq when people put their hands over their hearts. It is in such moments that we understand what the Catholic workers mean when they say, the true atheist is the one who refuses to see God's image in the face of their neighbor. Looking into the eyes of people who love us may be the clearest glimpse of God many of us will ever get in this world. I have an old hippie friend who loves Jesus and smokes a lot of weed, and he's always trying to get under my skin and stir up a debate, especially when I have an innocent young Christians visiting with me. The problem is that he knows the Bible better than most of them do. One day he said to me, Jesus never talked to a prostitute. I immediately went on the offensive. Oh, sure he did, and whipped out my sword of the Spirit and got ready to spar. Then he just calmly looked me in the eye and said, listen, Jesus never talked to a prostitute because he didn't see a prostitute. He just saw a child of God he was madly in love with. I lost the debate that night. When we have new eyes, we can look into the eyes of those who didn't even like and see the one we love. We can see God's image in everyone we encounter, as Henry Nouwen puts it. In the face of the oppressed, I recognize my own face, and in the hands of the oppressor, I recognize my own hands. Their flesh is my flesh, their blood is my blood, their pain is my pain, and their smile is my smile. We are made of the same dust. We cry the same tears. No one is beyond redemption, and we are free to imagine a revolution that sets both the oppressed and the oppressors free.